Tony. Welcome to So Lounge. Today is part 2 of sewing it all together. We're going to talk about putting bias tape as an edge finish around your neck and armholes and sewing the shoulder and side seams together. To get started, let's take a look at the instructions. Looking at our instructions, the next step is to sew the front and the back pieces together, and we're going to sew the shoulder seams first, and then the instructions say to sew the side seams. Now I'm not going to sew the side seams just yet because we know we have to put in a bias binding around that neckline, and that's going to be a lot easier to do when the side seams are not sewn yet. We'll sew the sides together when it comes to putting together the armholes, but as far as the next step goes, we're going to pin the shoulder seams together, and then we are going to sew them. And then following that, we're going to stay stitch around the neckline at 1/4 inch. And that is going to keep that neck hole from stretching out while we're pinning the bias tape to it. Let's start with the first part. We're going to pin the shoulders together. So grab the front piece of your garment, and you want to have the right sides together. So this is the front of my dress because the darts are on the inside, and then this is the back of my dress with the zipper pull at the very top. And I'm going to match up the notches that I previously had on my pattern, and I'm going to pin them together. I'm going to pin one at the notch and then probably one at the neckline, just to hold them in place. And then I'm going to go to the other shoulder on the other side, and I'm going to do the same thing. Next, once I finish doing this, line everything up, I'm going to go over to the machine, and I am going to show you how to stay stitch around the neck hole to hold it in place. So let's go to the machine. Now that we've pinned the shoulders together, the first step is going to be to sew in the shoulder seams. And to do that, we're just going to match the top edge with the 5/8 inch seam allowance mark on my machine. And I need to just scooch that over a little bit. There we go. And I'm just using my usual stitch of 2.5, and I'm just using a regular straight stitch and my regular presser foot. So I switched that out after the whole zipper thing, and now we're just back to normal. And I'm kicking things over. So just sew that real quick, and you do want to backstitch because that's going to hold everything in place. And take out the pins as you get to them. And then once you're finished sewing that shoulder seam, you continue to the other side. And once both of them are sewn, then we're going to go back to the iron and press open those seams so they're nice and flat before we sew with the stay stitching. So there we go. So we're starting on the top side, which would be the left side if it was right side out. And we are going to line up that zipper under the presser foot. We can actually put that a little bit behind. So line up your presser foot so the back of it is behind the zipper. And then we're going to line up that outside edge with the edge of the fabric. And we are just doing stay stitching, so it can be a little bit bigger. It's not going to be huge. We're going to roll it up to a 3. And it's going to be inside of the seam allowance, so we don't have to stress about it, but we're just putting it in there to hold everything together. And that's going to keep this neckline from stretching once we start messing with the bias tape, because we're going to have to do some pinning and curving of the bias tape, and it is going to be a lot easier to do that if the neckline isn't stretching with the bias tape. So this is why we pressed our seams open, so that when we do this, it will still stay nice and flat and they won't be wonky. So just work your fabric around and keep following that edge of the line. And just move your dress as needed to keep going. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. And now we're back to the other shoulder seam, so make sure it's all flat. Let's work that around. And then keep turning. Keep following it around. And then we're going to stop right before we get to this zipper tab and just lift up your needle, raise your presser foot, and we're going to cut off the threads. We do not need to backstitch. This is just stay stitching to hold it all in place. And you can see that that's what it's going to look like. So when we attach the bias tape, we're going to be sewing at a different line, but this will keep everything from stretching out and it'll keep our neckline the correct shape. The next step is to take the bias tape off of the card and to press out one side of it. So you want to keep one side folded, but you want to press the other one out. And I just press out the whole thing at once because we will probably use almost this entire package. And that way I don't have to come back after I've sewn in the neck bias tape just to do the arms and then each one. It's just easier to do it all at once. It helps if you don't have a cat on your ironing board. So I would recommend removing the cat first, and hopefully she won't come back and eat more bias tape because she's already done that. So just press it out and just make sure that you're only pressing out one side. And then just, you know, it's cotton, so put your iron on a cotton setting and then just use steam. And I'm just going to run this through and then we will meet back at the table. Once you've got your bias tape pressed open, you're going to take it and we're going to attach it to the right side of the garment. So you want to take the side that you press, that edge, and then you want to put that on the front of your garment. And Clementine is loving some bias tape, so that's part of the problem. And then you want the bottom folded part to be on the bottom edge. So you don't want that to be towards the inside of the garment. You want that to be on the outside of the garment, because effectively what we're doing is pinning this bias tape and then we're going to flip it and then we're going to pull it to the inside. And then that other fold is what we're going to attach to the inside of the garment. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so this is a very, very close-up of what I'm talking about, and Clementine grabbed the bias tape, so I need to find my end. So, as you can see, this is the side that we pressed open, and we still have this little flap under here, and that is the side that we want to put on the right side of the garment, but not this end, the other end. So, you want to, here we go. We're going to take our bias tape, and we're going to line it up along the edge. And then we're going to pin it. And so, like I was saying, we want this flap to be on the front side. You don't want it to be that way, because we are eventually going to stitch this in, and then this part is going to all roll to the inside, and then that'll finish off the neckline. So grab some pins. And I alternate between the small ones and the big ones. So we're going to line up the edge of the tape here with the edge of the zipper, and we've got that seam allowance folded under there. So we're going to pin that all through those 3 layers. So catch the zipper tape, the seam allowance, and the bias tape, and that's going to be the part to kind of hold it and start it off. And then you're going to bend the bias tape around the neckline. And this is tape that's cut on the bias, so it will bend and shape to your fabric. So that's what we're doing effectively. Get that smoothed out over there. Back to the first one. Okay, so I've got that all the way through. That's holding it in place. And then I'm going to go around the entire neckline and curve the bias tape and then pin every few inches to make it fit. And as you get to the seam allowances on the shoulder, you want to make sure that they are still open. And I usually put a pin into each seam allowance so that I know they're not going to get caught when I, well, that one's flat with the seam. So because of the stay stitching, these aren't going to move, but for future reference, sometimes you don't have stay stitching, and then you want to make sure that the seam allowance is open when you pin any kind of a facing or finish to it. So just keep it even. I kind of puckered it there, but keep edging it around, and it's going to curve really easily because it is cut on the bias. And you just want to finish going around the entire neckline until the whole piece is pinned. And then when you get to the other end, you want to finish it the same way that we began it. So you just want to line up the edge of the tape with the edge of the zipper, and you're just going to cut it off at that point. I've got my bias tape pinned to the neckline, which was what we started to do. And now it's time to sew. With just sewing in bias tape, it's the same as any other kind of regular stitch. My machine is set to a stitch length of 2.5, and I just have a straight stitch, regular standard foot. Let's go in for a closer look. We're going to be sewing on 3/8 of an inch. So we need to get out our handy measure, and this is 3/8 here. So let's see what line that falls up with. Looks like it's this first line just past the edge of the presser foot. So that's the one we are going to match the edge of the bias tape with. And we are going to just get the zipper tape lined up under there. It's a little chunky, so just do your best, and then start with it just a little bit behind the needle like we always do, because we're going to back stitch, and that makes a cleaner finish. So I'm going to roll my needle in as usual. I'm going to sew a couple of stitches and pull out this pin, and then I'm going to back stitch and go forward again. So I'm just going to follow around and take out the pins. Oops, sorry. Take out the pins as I get to it. And then that is how I'm attaching my bias tape to finish this edge. So just finish sewing, and then I will show you the next step. So our bias tape is all sewn onto the neckline, and you may be looking at this going, how am I supposed to turn this outside bias tape to the inside? It's got this huge seam in here that's way wider than the rest of the bias tape. Well, the next step is just glossed over on the sewing instructions. It just says trim seam allowance to a scant 1/4 of an inch, and then there's a single picture that you're supposed to figure out what you're supposed to do. So what we are going to do, and I'm going to show you this in a close-up in a sec, is we're going to trim down this top seam allowance, and that's the one we just sewed. So we're going to trim down closer to our stitch line so that then we can just flip the other bias tape around and sew it down to finish the neckline. All right, so here is the pattern instruction about trimming, and it's just this little picture. So if you're not sure what you're looking at, it doesn't look like very much. And here's the instruction: trim seam allowance to a scant 1/4 of an inch. So it's underneath the instructions on what width to sew the bias tape seam, but then you're just supposed to figure it out. So what we're talking about here is trimming down this part of the seam allowance towards the stitch line so that then you can turn this piece over and sew it to the underside and everything fits. Because if you try to do that now, you can see that the seam allowance is actually sticking out on the inside. So I'm going to grab my scissors, and I'm just going to start at the end, start at this end, and then I'm just going to trim it down. Now you can measure it or you can just eyeball it. It doesn't matter. Let me get out my little gauge. So let's see how close I am. So it's a teensy bit less than 1/4 of an inch, but that's fine. You could do closer. I think that's probably closer to 1/8 of an inch. Yes, so it's about 1/8 of an inch. It's not really gonna matter. Just don't get so close that you're in danger of cutting that stitch line or getting too close to it so the fabric will ravel out, because you don't want that to happen. So I'm just gonna keep cutting. And then you just go around the garment and cut it all off like that. And you can see that it'll just fall off. And then once we go on to the next step, it's going to be so much easier to fold this over and then sew it to the inside. So you can see now once we fold it over, of course it's not working, it's not cooperating. We're gonna fold it over and you can see how nice that seam will fit inside, and then that's gonna be the inside edge of the garment once we finish trimming all of these little pieces off. We're back at the ironing board because this is one of those times when the instructions leave out a detail that'll really make a difference in the way that your finished garment looks. So the next step on the instructions is to just fold over the bias tape and pin it and then baste it in place. Now, if we add an extra step and go to the ironing board like I am right now, and we press the seam with the bias tape, and we're going to press it open so that the seam allowance part is lying separate from the tape. So we're going to press the seam over towards the garment and we're going to leave the tape flat. So we're going to be pressing down the seam. It's going to create a nicer crease. And then once we fold it over and do our final stitching, it's going to look a lot sharper and cleaner, and it's going to look more professional, which is the goal. Whenever we're doing hand sewing, we want things to look very professional and neat, and this is just one extra step that'll quickly help us achieve that. This is a close-up of what I'm doing so you can see it a little bit better. So there is the top of the bias tape, and underneath is the seam allowance that we just cut short. And with the pattern instructions, they just want you to fold this over and stitch it in place. But what I am suggesting is that we press along this line here and we fold this other part of the seam towards the bottom so that it's going to be easierly enclosed, and you're going to get a nice crisp edge along here, which is going to make your garment look more professional. Once I finish pressing, the seam allowance is going to be against the body of the garment, and then once I fold over the bias tape, I'm going to have a nice crisp line. So the next step is to pin the bias tape around the neckline, and then we're going to stitch again. This is a close-up view. As you can see, the seam allowance is pressed against the body of the garment, and now we are folding the bias tape along this crisp edge, and we're going to pin it in place because then we have to go on to stitching. It's a little tough right here through this zipper, but I'll make it work. There we go. Okay, so just continue around, and now that you've pressed it, you can see how much easier it is to just follow around on that stitch line and press line. So just put the needles in, go around the whole garment, just rolling so you have a nice edge up here at the top, and then we're going to pin them into place. I'm pinning kind of at a diagonal because this is a narrow little bias tape, and it's going to hold a lot better. And it's going to be a little thick at the shoulders just because you've got that extra seam allowance there. So make sure you put a pin in to keep it from getting out of place. So just continue around the neckline, and then we will go back to the sewing machine. This is another one of those times when you need to decide if you want to follow the pattern instructions or not. Because the next step of the instructions is to baste this bias tape in place, which is just using the longest stitch on your machine, just to do a quick stitch to just hold it in place. Then it says to go back in and slip stitch by hand the bias tape to the fabric. Now I'm not going to do that because I don't really feel like I need to spend the time hand sewing this type of dress. This is a sporty kind of summer dress. It's just a fun cotton print. And if I stitch through the bias tape and it comes out on the other side, it's just going to create another stitch line. It's still going to look sporty, and that goes with my fabric. Now, if you had a finer fabric and you were using some kind of a crepe or a nice voile or a fancier fabric and you wanted it to look much more professional and dressier, then you wouldn't do an external stitch line. You could do it by hand. But that's not what I'm going to do today. So I've got my machine just set on my regular stitch length of 2.5. It's on a straight stitch, and I am going to line up this tape and I'm going to start sewing. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so I've got my fabric lined up. I'm going to take this pin out to get started, and I'm just got the needle just a little in front of this zipper coil because I want to make sure I hold that. Now, I'm not going to sew right on the very, very edge. I'm going to sew just about 1/8 of an inch. So I have this edge of the bias tape lined up with the inside edge of my presser foot. So that is what I'm going to line things up with. Let me figure out how to do this because all these cameras are in the way. All right. Let's try this and get going. So I'm going to do my usual back stitch to hold it in place. And then I'm going to hold my fabric and line it up so that it goes where it's supposed to, pulling out each pin as I get to it. So that's how I'm going to sew the entire neckline of my garment. And then through the magic of video, I am finished. And now raise that needle up, and then I'm going to raise up the presser foot as well. And this looks totally wonky. There we go. Apologies. And then we're going to pull out these threads. And if we go back to the right side of the neckline, you can see there is a stitch line, but it doesn't look bad. It goes with the overall look of the fabric. So that's why I did it, because I don't feel like hand sewing all of this part down here. So let's go on to the armholes. Now the neckline of the dress is completely finished, and it's time to move on to finish the armholes. We're going to do this exactly the same way that the neck was finished. So I'm going to pin the bias tape to the outside. I'm going to sew it on, I'm going to trim the seam, and then I'm going to flip it and sew it again. But I'm leaving these side seams open. So it's going to be a lot easier to get everything in to this curved line without having to worry about fitting it in sewing it in the round. We're going to sew it flat, which is going to be a lot easier and it's going to be faster. So I'm going to go through those steps and then we'll come back and I'm going to show you how to finish out your side seams. I have finished my armholes with the bias tape just the same way that I did with the neckline, and now I'm ready to sew the side seams. So I zipped up the back of the dress so it's easier to just keep everything straight and make sure I'm pinning the correct side seams together. And I'm just going to match the notches on the side of my fabric where I cut them out when I was cutting out the pattern. And I am just going to sew a regular 5" seam, and I'm going to sew from top to bottom. So just keep everything straight. And then once I am finished, I will press open that side seam, and then we're ready to move on to the hem. So let's head over to the machine. I'll run this up real quick, and then we'll keep going. I'm back at the sewing machine, and I'm just going to finish up these side seams. Just like everything else we've sewn for this entire garment, I've got my stitch length on 2.5, and I'm sewing with a straight stitch. The side seams are going to be sewn back at the standard 5/8 of an inch seam line. So I'm going to line everything up with the mark on my machine, and I'm just going to do the top part of the armhole, just match it up on the side, just sew the seam, and I'm not going to stress about it because it's going to get pressed open and we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's a lot easier to sew it in flat than to sew it in round. And if you don't believe me, you can try it out and see which technique you prefer. So let's get these sewn, and then I'm going to press them open and we'll move on to the hem. Yay, it fits! I'm always so excited when I get to this stage in construction and I can actually put it on my dress form and see how things are working, and it fits. This dress form is my size. She's a little bit taller than I am right now, but and then obviously this dress is for me. So I'm pretty excited that everything has worked out well, and it looks like it's going to be a loose comfy summer sort of dress. The neckline is a little bit high. We may go back and change that, but for now, totally wearable. The last step in the construction process is hemming. So regardless of what you're making, if you're making a jacket or a shirt or a skirt or a dress or a pair of pants, you're always going to put the hem in last. So you're going to complete everything else and then do the hem. So that is the very last step I have to complete to finish this dress out. Now I tried it on and the bottom length is just below my knee, and the pattern calls for a 2-inch hem, which means that if I fold it up, which I've done here, and then try it on again, just to make sure that the length is right and where it's supposed to be. So I've got it pinned and I'm pretty happy with it, but I'm going to double check one more time. And since hemming can present its own set of problems because there is how to finish the edge of the hem, you know, if I want to fold it under or zigzag stitch or add some hem tape, we're going to go into hemming in a different video. So I am going to finish out the dress in a separate video, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. If you have, be sure to click like below and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no answers, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by Sew Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions that you want, and I will do my very best to get you some answers. I go live in the group every week, usually on Wednesdays, so check the events tab for the schedule. And until we meet again, happy sewing!